The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made human skin look like it belonged in a morgue. Katie Morrison had learned to tune out the hum 3 years ago. Now it was just part of the breathing of Sacred Heart Hospital's oncology ward, as natural as the antiseptic smell that clung to her scrubs, as constant as the beeping of monitors that marked time in 6-second intervals. She moved through the ward at 6:13 a.m., before most of the day's shift arrived. Her name badge hung from a lanyard clipped to her waistband, and underneath it, sewn into the lining of her jacket that hung in her locker downstairs, was a faded unit patch from another life. She didn't let herself think about it. Thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to the kind of tremors in her hands that made for placement impossible. So she didn't think. She worked. The oncology ward at Sacred Heart ran like a machine with too many moving parts. 12 beds. 8 were occupied this morning. Room for 12 had a 73-year-old man with stage 4 pancreatic cancer who'd stopped eating 3 days ago. Room for 14 had a woman 41 years old who'd asked Katie yesterday if she thought God punished people for past mistakes. Katie had said, "I think God runs out of punishment ideas and lets us do it ourselves," which probably violated some hospital protocol about appropriate patient conversations, but the woman had laughed for the first time since admission. Katie pulled up the electronic charts on the computer at the nurse's station. The station was empty. It always was at this hour, just her and the night shift nurse finishing the last of her notes before heading home. Katie's eyes moved across the data with the kind of precision that came from paying attention when nobody else was watching. Numbers, trends, medication reconciliation, pre-procedure labs. She caught inconsistencies the way other people caught the scent of rain coming in from the Gulf. That's what happened in room for 11. The chart showed a surgical consult notation from yesterday, a routine biopsy prep that should have triggered a specific lab panel before the procedure. Katie scrolled back. The pre-op labs weren't there. The post-op labs were entered, but the pre-op sequence was missing from the record, and the timeline didn't match. A 12-hour gap where there should have been ordered tests. She marked it as a query, flagged it for the attending, and added a note, "Please verify preoperative lab order sequence per protocol." She didn't think anything of it. Protocol existed for a reason. People made mistakes. Charts got out of order. Hospitals ran on a chaos that only looked organized if you didn't look too closely. Dr. Daniel Sterling walked onto the ward at 7:41 a.m. with 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. He was the department head, silver-haired, expensive watch catching the light as he reviewed charts, the kind of man whose voice came from the back of his throat like a tank idling in a garage. He had built his reputation on being meticulous about procedure, which made what happened next interesting in the way that a fault line shifting under a city is interesting. He read Katie's query on room 411's chart. Katie was replacing for fluids on room for 16 when she heard him call her name, not a request, the way it was phrased. It was a command dressed in professional courtesy. "Ms. Morrison." A word. Katie finished hanging the bag, made sure the flow rate was set correctly, and turned to face him. This was the first rule of invisibility: respond immediately. Don't keep them waiting. That's what drew attention. Dr. Sterling's office was on the 3rd floor, but he didn't take her there. Instead, he pulled her into the medication room, a space lined with refrigerated units and controlled substance cabinets, fluorescent bright and utterly private. One of his residents stood in the doorway. "Your query on room for 11. He held up the tablet, and Katie could see the note she'd written displayed on the screen. "Walk me through your concern." Katie's hands were steady. Years of military training had taught her that steadiness was a choice, something you could manufacture even when your nervous system was screaming. The pre-op labs weren't entered in the chart before the procedure. Timeline shows the biopsy was performed without the standard preoperative panel. I flagged it for clarification. Dr. Sterling's eyes didn't move from the screen. "You're a registered nurse." "Yes, doctor." "Not a chart auditor. Not a billing specialist. A registered nurse." "Yes." "Then you're not responsible for questioning the decisions of attending physicians and surgical staff." He lowered the tablet. His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes, all teeth and distance. You're responsible for bedside care, patient comfort, medication administration. The charts are handled by people who understand the complete picture. People who have gone to medical school. Katie said nothing. This was the second rule of invisibility: don't explain yourself. Explanations made you memorable. I'm going to assume this was an error in judgment rather than an attempt to suggest that a surgeon on this hospital's staff might be cutting corners. He tilted his head, studying her the way someone studies a smudge on a mirror. It won't happen again. No, doctor. Good. You're dismissed. The medication room smelled like alcohol and something chemical underneath it, the kind of smell that lived in hospitals and nowhere else. Katie walked back to the ward, and the moment her shoes hit the tile floor of the oncology unit, the tension she'd been holding in her diaphragm released. Just barely. Just enough that she could breathe again. By 9:22 a.m., word had moved through the ward like electricity through water. Katie didn't know how Sterling had done it, probably a few pointed comments to the charge nurse, maybe a message in the group chat that all the staff monitored like hawks. But the effect was immediate. The break room became a space she occupied alone. She sat with her sandwich at 10:18 a.m., turkey and mustard on whole wheat, and watched as three of the nurses she worked with every single shift, nurses she'd helped through difficult patients, nurses whose preferred coffee orders she knew without being asked, grabbed their lunches from the refrigerator and left. Not together. That would have been too obvious. But within 60 seconds, all three of them were gone, and the door to the break room closed with a soft click. Katie ate her sandwich. The overhead speakers played something instrumental that was supposed to be calming. Outside the break room window, Houston's humidity pressed against the glass like something trying to get in. She finished eating, rinsed her container, and clipped her badge back onto her waistband, careful not to touch the jacket hanging in her locker downstairs. The humiliation came at 11:51 a.m. in room 409. The patient's name was Margaret Chen, 78 years old, admitted with stage 3 ovarian cancer. Her family had been there since dawn, a son and 2 daughters, all of them wearing the particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love disappear piece by piece. Margaret was stable. Comfortable. The pain was controlled. But families needed something to do with their hands and their worry, so they asked questions, and Katie answered them with the kind of patience that military training had installed so deep in her nervous system that it felt like oxygen. Dr. Sterling came through the door at 11:48 a.m. with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been watching for a moment when Katie was vulnerable. Mrs. Chen, I need to speak to you about a medication concern that's arisen with your care. He turned to face the family directly, and his voice dropped into that particular register that made terrible things sound like they were being delivered by someone trustworthy. We had a lapse in this patient's medication protocol this morning. Ms. Morrison administered a dose that should have been held pending lab work. Katie's blood pressure rose, but her face remained still. This was the rule she'd learned in Baghdad when mortars came in and you had to pretend the ground wasn't shaking beneath your feet, control what you can control. Your face. Your breathing. Your next move. That's not accurate, Doctor, Katie said. Her voice came out the way she meant it to, measured, precise, without defensiveness. I held the 8 a.m. dose pending the pre-op lab results. The notes are in the chart. Dr. Sterling's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Are you questioning my assessment of this patient's care? I'm correcting an inaccuracy in your statement. Margaret's son put a hand on his mother's shoulder. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. Katie could feel the family's fear crystallizing into something harder, into doubt, into the understanding that hospitals contained mistakes, that the people caring for their mother might not know what they were doing. That was what Sterling was selling them, uncertainty. He was selling the idea that Katie was incompetent, careless, a risk to patient safety. Mrs. Chen, your medication was held appropriately, Katie said directly to the patient. The labs came back at 10:13 a.m. I administered the dose at 10:26 a.m. with the physician's order. The chart reflects this. Dr. Sterling smiled that same smile. It's fortunate for you that the chart supports your version, Ms. Morrison. We'll consider this matter resolved. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Though I may want to revisit your documentation practices. Some of your charting is, shall we say, unusually detailed for a staff nurse. Almost as if you're trying to document procedures outside your scope of practice. He left. The room emptied of everything except the machinery and the family's uncertainty and Katie's steady hands. By 1:15 p.m., a formal write-up had been posted on the unit board. Katie's name was in red ink, which the hospital's patient safety protocol said was reserved for critical medication errors. The accusations were vague enough to be deniable and specific enough to be damaging, concerns about medication administration protocols and scope of practice documentation. Below that, Dr. Sterling's signature. Below that, a notation, staff member to receive additional training before resuming direct patient care assignments. Katie took a photo of it with her phone, not as evidence, though it was evidence of something. She took it because later, when she couldn't sleep at 3:27 a.m., she might need to remind herself that this was real, that she hadn't imagined the last 4 hours. That there was a paper trail of her being invisible and then suddenly, impossibly, visible in exactly the wrong way. She pulled the write-up from the board at 1:41 p.m. Her hands were steady. Nobody stopped her. Nobody even looked at her as she walked back to the medication room, pulled off the red-inked paper, and threw it into the waste bin under the sink. The afternoon stretched out like something alive. Katie finished her shift at 3:06 p.m., clocked out, and walked to her car in the parking lot where the heat was already making the asphalt shimmer. She drove home through Houston traffic with the radio off, her hands at 10 and 2, her breath shallow and controlled. She had kept herself invisible for 3 years. She had taken a job that required everything she was trained for and asked nothing of her except that she show up and do it well. She had learned the names of patients, had remembered their children's grades and their husbands' occupations, had given them the kind of attention that made them feel less alone when they were dying. And somehow, in trying not to be seen, she had made herself the most visible thing in Dr. Sterling's line of sight. The question was why? The question, the one that would keep her awake at 2:36 a.m., the one that would sit in the back of her mind like a piece of shrapnel working its way toward something vital, was what she had actually threatened by paying attention to the details nobody else was bothering to notice. The formal write-up appeared on the unit board at 6:13 a.m., posted in red ink by someone who'd never learned the difference between accountability and cruelty. Katie's name. Highlighted. A list of infractions she hadn't committed, signed by Dr. Sterling with the flourish of a man who'd just painted her as incompetent in front of every nurse, resident, and orderly who passed that corridor. The medication documentation discrepancy she'd flagged, the one that was actually there, the one Sterling had ordered her to forget, had become, according to the official record, a pattern of careless charting and failure to follow protocol. The handwriting was his. Precise. Deliberate. Designed to stay. She read it at 6:14 a.m. She did not touch it. She did not take it down. She simply stood there for 14 seconds, breathing, while 3 nurses who'd been her allies yesterday suddenly became very interested in the hallway carpet. One of them, Sarah, looked up and almost said something, then didn't. The silence that followed was the kind that teaches you something about yourself you'd rather not know. The hallway confrontation came 47 minutes later when Sterling found her restocking the oncology supply closet. The space was narrow. He chose it deliberately. He always chose the places where running wasn't clean. "You understand what you've done here," he said. Not a question. His voice had the texture of someone used to being obeyed, the cadence of a man who'd learned long ago that volume could substitute for reasoning. "You questioned my judgment in front of a patient's family. You compromised my authority. You made me look incompetent." Katie continued folding washcloths. Her hands moved with the same rhythm they had before he entered. In, fold, stack. In, fold, stack. Muscle memory wasn't unique to combat. It existed in repetition. In any action performed 1,000 times until it became breath. "Do you have any idea," he continued, stepping closer, how privileged you are to work here. How many people would kill for your position? She folded another washcloth. I'm speaking to you, Morrison. She set the washcloth down and turned to face him. One measured breath. The kind that emptied her entirely and filled her back up with something colder. Her eyes met his. Yes, doctor. His face reddened. He was expecting something else, a tremor in her voice, an apology, a breakdown. He was hunting for weakness the way certain men always do, with the patience of someone who believes he owns the space he's standing in. You're a mediocre nurse with delusions of competence. The write-up stays. You're on a performance improvement plan effective immediately. One more mistake, Morrison, one, and I'll have you terminated for cause. No severance. No recommendation. Just gone. Katie let the silence between them stretch. 2 seconds. 3. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them, steady and indifferent. I've survived worse men than you, doctor. She said it so quietly he almost missed it. No anger. No defiance. Just a statement of fact, delivered the way someone might describe weather. The flatness of it, the complete absence of emotion, seemed to travel through his nervous system like ice water. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Then he turned and left, his shoes clicking against the tile in that rapid, uneven rhythm that told her she'd landed something. He didn't understand what she meant. He was never going to understand what she meant. That was the exact point. The rest of the morning moved through her like water through gauze. She checked vitals. She drew labs. She made notes in charts with the precision she always used, each letter measured, each number accurate. In the break room, she sat down with her lunch at 11:22 a.m. The room held 6 other nurses. Within 90 seconds, all of them stood, gathered their containers, and left. One didn't even take her coffee. The message wasn't subtle. It was designed to be seen. Katie sat alone at the table and ate her sandwich. Turkey. Wheat bread. Mustard. She finished it in 7 minutes. She did not leave early. She did not cry. She simply existed in that space, alone, and made herself small enough that she could fit inside the isolation without breaking. By 2:06 p.m., a Marine general had been admitted to the ICU. Nobody told Katie. She didn't need to be told. She found out the way she found out most things in hospitals, by listening to the way conversations changed when she entered a room. Whispers. The kind of sudden professionalism that descended over the staff when someone with real authority was present. A general. Decorated. Quiet. He'd come in for a routine consultation about a persistent respiratory issue, nothing acute, nothing alarming, just a precaution, just wanting the hospital's top surgeon to take a look because he'd been having some tightness in his chest. She saw him once, in passing, in the hallway outside ICU. An older man, lean in the way that comes from discipline rather than illness. Silver hair. Posture that seemed to hold the entire corridor in alignment just by existing. He was walking beside one of the surgical residents, discussing something quietly, and Katie did what she always did when faces from the world she'd buried threatened to surface. She did not look. She kept her eyes forward. She moved past. That night, the dreams started again. They came in fragments, the way combat memories always do, not linear, not narrative, but sensory. Pure sensory. She was drawing blood from a patient in the afternoon, the tourniquet tight around an elderly woman's upper arm, the smell of antiseptic rising into her sinuses, and suddenly she wasn't in Houston anymore. She was in Baghdad. Fallujah. 2004, dust rising like particulate matter in a blood test, the kind of dust that gets into everything and never fully comes out. Mortar fire. The sound registered as something else, a monitor alarm, a cart collision, and her body responded before her mind could catch up. Her hand steady. Her breathing controlled. The patient she was drawing from was looking at her strangely, noticing the way her eyes had gone dark, the way her jaw had clenched for just a moment before she remembered where she was. "You okay, hun?" the woman asked. Katie blinked. The dust was gone. There was air conditioning. Fluorescent lights. A patient in a hospital gown with genuine concern on her face. "Yes. I'm fine. Just caught a headache." But she wasn't fine. By evening, the fragments were coming faster. A child's voice, crying, confusion, and then silence. The particular silence that comes after small people stop believing anyone will save them. The smell of diesel fuel and blood and something that might have been fear, except fear didn't smell like anything. It was just the absence of all the things that came before it. She'd buried this. For 3 years, she'd buried this so deep that she could wake up in the morning and be just a nurse. Just a woman who changed bedpans and drew blood and didn't remember that her hands had ever held anything but a syringe. She'd built an entire existence on forgetting, and it had worked until it didn't. By midnight, she was sitting in her car in the Sacred Heart parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, watching her hands shake in a way she hadn't allowed them to shake in public in 36 months. The shake wasn't fear. The shake was restraint. It was the effort of keeping something locked down that wanted, that needed, to break free. She didn't go back inside. She sat in the car until her hands stopped moving. Then she drove home to her daughter asleep in the bedroom down the hall, to the small rental house that was supposed to be her new life, to the quiet that was supposed to have healed her. And she sat at the kitchen table in the dark, still wearing her scrubs, and waited for morning to come like it always did, whether she was ready for it or not. But that wasn't the worst part. The ICU monitors began their warning song at 2:02 p.m. on a Tuesday. Katie was restocking the suction canisters outside room for 12 when the alarm started, not the rhythmic beeping of routine vitals, but the sustained scream of a ventilator alarm that meant something had catastrophically failed. She knew that sound. She'd heard it in Baghdad in the rubble of a collapsed clinic, heard it in the dark of a forward operating base when a Marine's lung had collapsed during transport. The body remembers before the mind catches up. She moved toward the sound. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, was already at the bedside, but his movements were reactive, uncertain, checking monitors, adjusting dials with the hesitation of a man trying to read a foreign language. The general lay rigid on the mattress, his chest locked in a spasm, his lips taking on that particular shade of blue that meant no oxygen was reaching tissue. His oxygen saturation was tanking. 68. The machines didn't lie. His breath wasn't reaching his lungs because something was compressing them from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis assembled itself in her mind before the clinical confirmation, muscle memory overriding 3 years of deliberate invisibility. Katie pushed past the threshold of the room without waiting for permission. The movement was automatic, the same way soldiers breach doors, the same way nurses with field experience move toward dying patients, without hesitation, without apology. "Triage protocol," she said to Dr. Chen. "He's crashing." Unilateral breath sounds. Dr. Chen stared at her like she'd spoken Mandarin. The monitors screamed. The general's oxygen saturation dropped again. 64, the code would be called in 90 seconds and he'd be dead in 4 minutes. She could feel the clock ticking like a second heartbeat. Right chest. Diminished, Dr. Chen finally answered, still frozen. Katie was already moving to the crash cart. Her hands knew exactly where everything lived. She'd memorized the layout of every cart in Sacred Heart in her first month, a habit from a lifetime of needing to know where the life-saving equipment was hidden. She grabbed the 14-gauge needle from the trauma kit, the largest bore that would fit, the kind that would let air escape like a hiss from a pressure valve. Her breathing dropped to tactical rhythm. In through the nose. Steady. The world didn't shrink, it expanded into perfect clinical clarity. 2 minutes, she said to no one. He's not going to make a full code. This is needle decomp or he dies right now. She didn't ask permission. There was no time for hierarchy, no room for protocol that would turn a living patient into a corpse while forms were being filed. She positioned herself at his right side, counting ribs like a prayer. First rib. Second rib. She found the spot, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact anatomical real estate she'd memorized 15 years ago in a training video and reinforced 1,000 times in the worst moments of her life. Her fingers marked the spot. The needle went in, angled upward at exactly 45 degrees. The hiss came. The sound of pressure releasing. The sound of a man's lungs getting room to breathe again. The monitors shifted. Oxygen saturation began climbing. 75. The attending physician's eyes went wide, not because she'd done it well, but because he'd realized what had just happened in his own ICU. 82. Katie held position, watching the general's chest expand. The rigid muscles loosened. His lips went from that terrible blue toward a shade that meant life was returning. 88. She could feel the room holding its breath. She wasn't holding hers. Her hands were steady as surgical steel, her voice the particular calm that came from having already survived worse. Sinus rhythm, she said, reading the monitor. O2 sat 92. Stable. The general's eyes opened. They moved, confused and dilated, but alive. Katie stepped back from the bedside exactly one pace. Not fleeing. Not apologizing. Just receding to the space where an invisible nurse belonged. But as she moved, her scrub pocket caught on the bedside rail, and the general's hand shot out with surprising strength. His fingers found her wrist. Not a grip. A recognition. His eyes tracked her face. Senior Chief. His voice was barely a whisper, fractured, confused. You can't be here. You were. She said nothing. She couldn't. Her throat had closed in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with standing on the edge of a precipice she'd thought she'd escaped. Dr. Chen was shouting for respiratory, for the trauma team, for someone to call cardiothoracics. The room was flooding with personnel, the kind of controlled chaos that meant a near-death had been caught at the exact moment the universe allowed for catching. But no one was looking at the monitors now. They were looking at her. The general's grip on her wrist didn't loosen. His eyes, sharp now, the confusion burning away like fog under sun, stayed locked on her face. And in that moment, Katie understood that the past she'd buried in Houston's humidity and hospital anonymity had just opened its mouth and called her name. She pulled her wrist free with gentle precision and turned toward the equipment carts. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Chen asking the general who she was, could hear the attending physician's voice rising in volume, could feel the weight of every eye in the room suddenly understanding they were standing next to someone entirely different from the woman they thought they'd known. She didn't turn back. She grabbed fresh gloves from the dispenser, the snapping sound sharp as a gunshot in the sudden silence, and walked toward the medication station. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the general's hand reaching out again toward empty air, trying to grasp something invisible, his voice cracking with something that sounded like recognition and 18 years of distance finally collapsing into a single moment of impossible reunion. And somewhere in the Houston heat and the antiseptic smell of the ICU, Katie Morrison felt the last thread of her invisibility snap. 30 seconds. That's how long it took for everything to collapse. The monitor sang its recovery song, oxygen climbing toward normal, the general's chest rising with breath that his own body had forgotten how to take. Sinus rhythm. The room went dead silent. Katie's hands were still steady, the needle withdrawn, the crisis dissolved into the sharp chemical smell of adrenaline wearing off and the antiseptic burn of a hospital that had just watched someone pull a man back from the edge of nothing. The general's fingers found her wrist. His grip was weak but the contact held meaning, his eyes searching her face with a recognition so complete it was like watching someone see a ghost they'd stopped believing in. He opened his mouth. A single word emerged, fractured and impossible. Senior Chief. Katie pulled her hand back. Wrong person, sir. She turned toward the door. Dr. Sterling was standing in the threshold, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression frozen in the exact moment he processed what he'd just witnessed. Not a doctor stumbling through protocol. Not a nurse following orders. a woman who had placed her hands on a Marine general's chest with the precision of someone who had done this before, in conditions far worse than a sterile hospital room with a full surgical team standing by. The color drained from Sterling's face in stages. Red to pink to ash. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply turned and walked back into the corridor, and Katie heard the distinctive sound of someone making calls, 3 of them in rapid succession, his voice clipped and controlled but carrying the unmistakable tone of a man activating a network he'd spent years cultivating. The board president. The hospital's malpractice attorney. 2 investigators he'd cultivated through carefully distributed favors, the kind of men who moved on phone calls and didn't ask questions. By 1438, they were in the hospital administrator's office. By 1506, Katie's suspension was official. Practicing beyond your scope of licensure, Sterling said, reading from a document that had been drafted with the efficiency of something prepared in advance and simply waiting for the right moment. Performing unauthorized procedures. Interfering with physician-directed care. Jeopardizing patient safety through reckless intervention. Katie stood in the center of the room, Sterling on one side, the administrator on the other, a witness from HR taking notes with the careful precision of someone documenting a termination. The administrator wouldn't meet her eyes. The HR witness looked like she wanted to disappear. You endangered that patient, Sterling continued, and his voice had found its rhythm again, the same rhythm he used where he was certain of his power. You contaminated a sterile field. You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. These are not minor infractions, Katie. These are career-ending violations. Katie had faced worse men than Sterling. She'd faced men with weapons and nothing to lose and the kind of desperation that made them dangerous in ways this comfortable doctor could never understand. But she'd made a choice 3 years ago to step away from that world, to become someone small and invisible and safe. To become just a nurse. I understand, she said quietly. Your employment is terminated effective immediately, the administrator said, still not looking up. Security will escort you to clear your locker. You'll surrender your badge and credentials. There will be no severance. The hospital is not responsible for. I understand, Katie said again. She walked to the locker room alone. Security gave her space, the kind of space you give someone who's been marked, who's become untouchable. Her locker was small, her presence there easy to erase. A few personal items. 2 photographs, one of her daughter at age 6, one of her and her sister taken before everything changed. A stethoscope with her name engraved on the earpiece. A half-empty bottle of hand lotion with the expensive label that one of the nurses had recommended. She reached to the back of the locker where the old field jacket hung behind her clean scrubs. The jacket was weathered, the kind of worn that comes from years of use in conditions that don't care about preservation. The kind of worn that tells stories no one asked to hear. Her fingers found the seam in the lining where she'd sewn the unit patch years ago, faded fabric with lettering that had nearly disappeared under sunlight and time and the weight of trying to forget. She pulled the patch free, the stitches giving way easily because she'd always known they would, that someday she'd need to let it go. But she didn't let it go. She held it instead, her thumb moving across the letters she could no longer read but would never forget, and for a moment the break room disappeared and she was 19 years old again, standing in the dust and the heat, receiving this patch from someone who'd believed she'd survive the things that were coming. Her badge clattered against the metal shelf as she set it down. The drive home took 23 minutes. She didn't change. She didn't stop anywhere. She drove straight to her small house in a quiet neighborhood where the trees blocked the worst of the Houston sun and a 10-year-old girl was about to come home from school expecting to see her mother at the usual time. Katie was sitting at the kitchen table when Maya found her. The light through the window was afternoon gold, hitting the table at an angle that meant it was only 14:48, which meant school hadn't even been over for an hour, which meant Katie wasn't supposed to be here at all. Maya stood in the doorway with her backpack still on, her lunchbox dangling from one hand, her face shifting through the arithmetic of a child trying to understand what didn't fit the pattern. "Mommy, why are you home so early?" Katie's hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her scrubs were still damp with the antiseptic smell of the hospital, the general's blood still a faint brown stain on the cuff. She had no answer that a 10-year-old could understand. She had no answer at all. "Come here, baby," she said, and her voice sounded like something breaking, which it was. Maya set down her things slowly. She climbed into her mother's lap the way she hadn't done in months, the way children do when something in the air tells them that the normal rules have changed. Katie held her daughter against the scrub fabric, breathing in the smell of her hair, peppermint shampoo and chalk dust from art class, and wondered how long she could hold on to this before the question started. Before Maya asked why her mother had been crying. Before she had to explain that sometimes the strong fall too, that sometimes being invisible wasn't about safety at all. It was about erasure. The rain started at 1851. Katie waited until Maya was asleep, tucked into bed with her nightlight casting animal shapes across the ceiling, her breathing soft and even and innocent of the fact that her mother's entire world had just contracted to the size of a single day's bad decisions. Then Katie sat at the kitchen table again, watching the rain hit the glass in sheets, and pulled out her phone. No missed calls. No messages. The nursing network had already sealed her out. Invisible nurses stay invisible, even when they're falling. Especially then. The unit patch was still in her hand. She'd carried it from the hospital without consciously deciding to, the way you carry the things that are too heavy to leave behind but too dangerous to keep. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling the weight of all the years she'd tried to bury it, all the nights she'd woken up gasping because Baghdad wouldn't let her go, because the sound of that child's breathing through the tracheotomy she'd cut into his throat at age 23 was the kind of sound that followed you forever. The rain hammered harder. It sounded like applause or judgment, and Katie couldn't decide which. She stood up. Walked to the kitchen window. For one moment, just one, she held the patch over the sink, her fingers loosening. It would be so easy to let it go. To watch it fall into the drain with the coffee grounds and the small debris of a life that wasn't working anymore. To be finally, completely erased. To disappear into the anonymity she'd been chasing for 3 years and never actually find. The helicopter sound cut through the rain at 1922. At first, Katie thought she was hallucinating. The rain was loud and she was exhausted, and her mind had been doing strange things since she'd held the general's chest open and felt her field medicine knowledge come alive in her hands like muscle memory that never actually went away. But the sound grew louder, underneath the rain, a rhythm that wasn't weather. A rhythm that was mechanical and impossible and getting closer. She looked out the window. The helicopter descended toward the intersection 3 blocks away, its rotors sending rain sideways, its searchlight cutting through the darkness. Through the kitchen window, Katie watched it touch down, and in that moment, suspended between the life she'd built and the life she'd left, she understood that invisibility was over. The unit patch was still in her hand. She didn't let it go. The helicopter descended through Houston's humid morning, its shadow sweeping across the parking lot of Sacred Heart Hospital like a predator's wing. Rotor wash scattered trash and sent the hospital's flag snapping horizontal. 3 humps had already cleared the emergency bay entrance, boots on tile moving with the precision of men who'd done this 1,000 times in places the news didn't cover anymore. Dr. Sterling stood in the administrator's office on the 4th floor, prepared statements in his folder, his malpractice attorney on speakerphone, 2 board investigators positioned in the hallway waiting for his signal. The suspension paperwork was printed. The narrative was locked. Katie Morrison was finished. He'd made 3 strategic calls that morning, to the board president's chief of staff, to his contact at the state medical board, to a journalist he'd cultivated for exactly these moments. By noon, she'd be a cautionary tale about scope creep and reckless heroics. By next week, her name would be forgotten. The hospital administrator's phone rang at 8:44 a.m. Then again. Then again. Security burst in. "Sir, we have military personnel in the ICU requesting." The administrator didn't wait for the explanation. He was already moving toward the elevator, his face the color of office paper. Sterling followed, confused, still holding his termination folder like a life preserver. The ICU doors opened and the room contracted. A full-bird colonel stood at the general's bedside in dress blue so crisp they could cut skin. His boots were polished to mirror shine. Behind him, 3 Marines in combat fatigue stood with the kind of stillness that comes from training to move only when ordered. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electrical prayer, indifferent to rank. The general lay propped on pillows, his breathing easier now, color returning to lips that had been blue 6 hours ago. His eyes found her across the room. Not the doctor's. Not Sterling. Her. Senior Chief Petty Officer, the general said, and his voice broke like old ice. 20 years erased in those 3 words. He'd been 8 years old in Fallujah when the mortars came. She'd shielded him with her own body while performing a cricothyrotomy with trauma shears and a prayer. He'd grown into a man who commanded thousands. But in this moment, he was a child again, seeing his savior. The administrator approached the colonel, nervous protocol flickering across his face. The colonel didn't acknowledge him. I need the personnel file for the individual who performed the emergency procedure on General Mitchell. Full clearance. Now. The administrator's hand shook as he opened Katie's file on the nearest workstation. 2 nurses gasped when he began reading aloud. The first paragraph. Then the second. Then the third. 20 years of classified service records, each sentence heavier than the last. Deployment redacted but implied. Citations that came from operations most people would never know happened. The women beside him held their breath like they'd walked into a cathedral. The colonel stepped forward, his voice carrying through the ward with the weight of an order. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. The room absorbed it. 2 purple hearts. Another pause. Every eye in the unit swiveled toward Katie, who stood absolutely still, watching the general's face. And a Navy Cross for actions at Fallujah, July 2004. Sterling's face went from red to ash white in a single heartbeat. The folder fell from his hands. Papers scattered across the tile like snow. You'll want to speak with our IT director, the administrator said quietly, his voice steadier now. A Marine Corps veteran named Jackson stepped through the crowd, holding a laptop. Footage played across the screen, Sterling at 2 in the morning, hands shaking as he tried to delete the security recordings of Katie's life-saving procedure. Every keystroke captured. Every moment of evidence destruction documented. I've already submitted everything to the medical board and the FBI, sir, Jackson said. Task Force Cybercrime Unit is handling it. Sterling's breath came faster. His attorney's voice crackled from the phone on the desk, don't say anything. Don't say anything. We're not admitting. You fired her, the colonel said. It wasn't a question. 1 hour after she saved a superior officer's life. That's attempted intimidation of a witness and obstruction of a federal investigation. The silence was so complete you could hear rain beginning against the windows. Sterling's composure shattered like dropped glass. She was practicing beyond her scope, she had no authorization, his voice climbed, cracking. I was protecting this institution from liability. By deleting evidence. Jackson turned the laptop around. Footage again. Sterling's face on the screen, the timestamp rolling, 2:14 a.m., 2:19 a.m., 3:22 a.m. Delete. 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 She was nobody, Sterling said, desperation bleeding into every word. Just some nurse. The colonel took 1 step forward. 1. His presence made the air pressure change. That's the general you just disrespected. And that's the officer you tried to destroy. He nodded to Jackson, who made a radio call. 3 minutes later, FBI badges flashed in the doorway. Boots on tile. Federal agents moved through the unit with the quiet authority of people who'd been waiting for this moment. 1 agent approached Sterling with handcuffs in her grip. Dr. Marcus Sterling, you're under arrest for attempted evidence destruction, fraud related to patient billing practices, and witness intimidation. The handcuffs clicked closed around his wrists. As they escorted him through the hallway, past rooms where patients watched in shock, past the nurse's station where his colleagues suddenly found their paperwork very interesting, his mouth moved in excuses that nobody heard anymore. His face had gone grey, like someone had slowly drained the blood from his skin. 6 months later, Katie stood in her dress uniform at her daughter's school, where they'd asked her to speak for career day. The uniform hung perfectly, pressed sharp enough to salute with. Parents and kids crowded the gym, curious about the woman in navy blues with decorations across her chest that caught the light like warnings. Dr. Sterling was 2 states away by then, selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall urgent care in Tucson. His medical license had been revoked during the federal investigation into phantom procedures and inflated billing codes that ran back 7 years. 340 patients had been overbilled. The settlement was still in litigation. His name appeared in quarterly fraud alerts sent to every hospital in the state. When someone called him doctor, his shoulders tensed and he didn't correct them. That night, Katie came home. Her daughter was asleep. The house was quiet in the way that only homes can be, where the walls know your secrets. Katie opened the old field jacket hanging in her bedroom closet, the one she'd taken with her when she disappeared 3 years ago. The unit patch was sewn into the lining, faded from sand and sun and years of being buried. She'd kept it all this time without understanding why. A ghost stitched into fabric. A name she wasn't supposed to answer to anymore. The general had come to the school that afternoon, moving slower than he should have, his chest still tender from the pneumothorax, but present. He'd stood in the back of the gymnasium while Katie spoke about nursing, about service, about the moments when training takes over and you stop thinking and just act. After the presentation, he'd approached her. Didn't ask permission. Had just reached out and touched that faded patch she was wearing on her dress blues. His hand shook slightly. "You kept it all these years," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact, spoken like a prayer of thanksgiving. Like she'd kept him. Like some part of her had refused to let go of who she'd been, even while she was trying to become someone else. Katie had nodded once. That was all the answer required. She was done running. Not just from Dr. Sterling, not just from the humiliation he'd orchestrated, but from the woman she'd buried in Houston's humidity and forgettable routines. That woman was still here. That woman had always been here, hand steady and heart stronger than any scar tissue could damage. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from having survived things that would break ordinary people into powder. Sacred Heart had offered her the position of Chief of Trauma by month 3 of the investigation's conclusion. New protocols. Better oversight. A formal apology from the board. She'd turned it down. Instead, she worked as a nurse in the oncology ward, still checking vitals, still drawing blood, still holding the hands of people who were scared. But now everyone knew. Now when she walked into a room, staff stood straighter. Patients asked her name. Families thanked her not just for the care, but for the person underneath the scrubs, the one who'd earned the right to be there. Her daughter asked that night, after homework and dinner and the rituals of ordinary life, "Mommy, are you happy now?" Katie looked at the unit patch in her hands, at the photograph on her nightstand showing a much younger version of herself in body armor and a determined expression, at the reflection in the window showing a woman who'd learned to stop hiding. "Yeah," she said. "I am. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, what would you have done differently?" Subscribe for more stories about the ones who change everything when it matters most.